Hello, today is Saturday, January 13th. My name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace based in Washington, D.C. Today is day 99 since October 7th. Since that day, I've been giving daily updates, and many of you may know today is a day of global action calling for a ceasefire. One of the names for the global ceasefire movement is Ceasefire Now. And in Washington, D.C., there's scheduled to be a protest march calling for a ceasefire. Our group, Churches for Middle East Peace, is participating in that. And then afterwards, we're having a prayer vigil in the afternoon. And then tomorrow morning here in Jerusalem, where I am joining you from, we'll be having a prayer service that will be streamed live that you'll be able to watch. If you miss it because of time zones, you'll be able to watch it after the fact. We are praying for peace. We are calling for an end to violence against all civilians. The atrocities of October 7th absolutely should be condemned, but we must understand that before October 7th, there was a decades-long occupation against the Palestinian people, that Gaza was living under blockade for 16 years, and it in no way justifies violence. We're a nonviolent organization. We are speaking out against anti-Semitism, but we are calling for an end to the bombing and killing of children and civilians in Gaza. And the world also is calling for an end to mass killings, to what we believe is an ethnic cleansing, and many people are saying is a genocide. And at a minimum, we have to prevent what's happening there. It is in the best interest, certainly, of the people of Gaza, but also of Israelis, be they Jewish or Palestinian. It is in the best interest of the broader Middle East. I'll give some updates about that today. It's in the best interest of the United States and of the world. What an incredible privilege it is for me to be here in the Holy Land. I'm currently in Jerusalem, even in the midst of such challenging and devastating times. A part of the day yesterday and last night, I had the opportunity to spend some time with pastors and Christian leaders in Jerusalem, and then in the Bethlehem area in the occupied West Bank. We prayed together and cried together and sought God. We prayed for peace. We talked about the desperate need to say enough. We wrestled through questions about what can the church do and how can we support one another and stand in solidarity? How can we be faithful to God while not standing by in silence while death and destruction continues? Friends, there is much work to be done. As the bombing of Gaza continues, people in Gaza are dying. They are suffering. They are without adequate food, aid, water. And global anti-Semitism is also on the rise, and it is unacceptable, and it must stop. And the politicization of all things is sought, the using of news, the using of trauma to manipulate or to justify. It makes me think of the verses in scripture that say, let your yes be yes and your no be no. It is so hard to make sense of the behind the scenes, the politics. And one of the things we've learned is that in the Israeli news, so many Israelis are not having the opportunity to even see what's happening in Gaza. Right? And so how can you have empathy for things that you don't see? And that's not an excuse, but, we're guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. And the same thing, in the Palestinian community. And so for those of us who have access to this broader picture, might we not cause further division? Now, that doesn't mean compromising on issues of human rights. It doesn't mean compromising, but it does mean calling for the humanity of all people to be recognized. It means not causing harm in our pursuit of justice. It means for us who self-identify as Christians being motivated by love. I've talked before about the task of a leader is carrying the pain of your people. And it means being willing to enter into the pain and trauma of different communities, which we've not done very well at. Certainly not over the decades of war, of occupation here in this land, but also not since October of last year. In the midst of all that, there is further militarization, which is bolstered by U.S. government support. There are more attacks, there is violence, there are escalations in the West Bank, there's escalations in the broader region. Following yesterday's attacks, the U.S. bombed Yemen, and the U.S. in coalition with the U.K., the Houthis in Yemen were bombed, and there's fear that the Houthis might retaliate. U.S. spokesperson Kirby said, "We're not interested in a war with Yemen. We're not interested in a conflict of any kind here." He said that they hit valid, legitimate military targets with drones and missiles. It came out that the coalition targeting Houthi militants, that's from the news, in Yemen on Thursday night carried out even more strikes than were initially disclosed, 12 additional locations, in addition to more than 150 munitions having been dropped on dozens of targets. The U.S. also announced that it was imposing further sanctions on Houthi financial facilitators. Europe responded and is split on the decision for the US and the UK to strike Houthis in Yemen. Italy, Spain, and France stood out on Friday by not taking part in the strikes, and they did not sign a statement that 10 countries put out justifying the strikes. Turkey responded, and President Erdogan said that the strikes in Yemen were disproportionate use of force, and he accused the US and the UK of trying to turn the Red Sea into a sea of blood. Whereas Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, called for restraint after the airstrikes on Yemen. Saudi called for avoiding escalation. One of the concerns is that there might be a response to the US and UK bombings, which of course were, if you listen to my updates, because Yemen, or the Houthis in Yemen, have been attacking ships in the Red Sea that are headed toward Israel. Other big news this week that's been culminating is the case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Yesterday, Friday, Israel responded to accusations posed by South Africa that they are committing genocide in Gaza. On Thursday, South Africa outlined its claim. Friday, Israel responded in 3 hours of remarks. They dismissed the plausibility of genocide. They said that South Africa's presentation was grossly distorted and that Hamas was ignored. They said South Africa's argument largely ignored the role of Hamas in the fighting and the weaponizing of the International Convention Against Genocide. According to the Israeli arguments, South Africa has now sought to invoke this term in the context of Israel's conduct in a war it did not start and did not want, a war in which Israel is defending itself against Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist organizations that have no bound. Now, a lecturer at the University of South Australia was explaining at this stage, South Africa does not need to prove that Israel is committing genocide. All it needs to establish is that there's a plausible risk of genocide occurring. It's important to note that the death toll is now at more than 22,000 people, predominantly women and children in Gaza. A few more updates in that regard. Israel said that South Africa has cherry-picked quotes in its seeking to justify the genocidal intent coming from leaders of the Israeli government, stating that Israeli officials have deliberately used dehumanizing language in an attempt to normalize genocidal rhetoric. South Africa, according to Israel, also failed to present other statements from senior leaders calling for humanitarian aid. I just learned in the last few days since I've been here that what was communicated at the beginning of October 7th and thereafter was Israel said it cut off the water, food, and gas. The government in Gaza, the government in Israel cut off water, food, and gas in the first few days after October 7th. And what was communicated here on the ground is that none would be turned back on and no shipments of humanitarian aid would be allowed in until the hostages that were taken on October 7th and 8th would be returned. And so the US has been saying one of their successes has been allowing in the humanitarian aid. And so Israel in this argument in court has been saying, look, we're allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza. If we were acting genocidally, we would not be allowing in aid. The Israeli delegation also cited measures to guide civilians away from danger, including phone calls and leaflets. The increased pace of aid trucks was further evidence that they do not have genocidal intent. I mentioned already the Global Day of Action calling for a ceasefire. I feel like these updates could go on and on. I'm learning so many things. I try to keep them at less than 10 minutes a day. I'll continue to give updates throughout my time here. Do please work for peace, pray that there would be an end to all violence. It is having devastating effects, not only in the immediate killing, but in also the trauma that's being inflicted and in the tensions that are rising in terms of the broader geopolitics of the region.